Obviously, the Louvre and the Museum of Modern Art are very, very different kinds of projects, but they represent, I think, two excellent examples of a tendency that started almost 30 years ago with two terribly important projects, one in Europe, one in the United States, and those were, of course, Beaubourg in Paris, and almost at the same time, the addition to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. They represented, first in Europe and then in the United States, the start of an extraordinary period of reconstruction, requalification, addition, and complete transformation of museums. We all know all of the sociological and cultural reasons that pushed for that kind of activity. And we are, I would suggest, now almost 30 years later, at a moment where people are really beginning to take a step back and to ask, what is it that this experience has brought us to? Are we still in a position, for example, when we can continue to assume that tourism will grow without limits, that museums and other cultural institutions will continue to be the sources of interest for tourism, that travel will continue in the way that it has. And I think that the results of this extraordinary period need some of the great optimism with the early projects. So the Louvre and MoMA, two very, very different projects. The Louvre, obviously, the great state museum of France. MoMA, a very important collection, but a private collection, one of many, many museums in New York. The Louvre, obviously, a building of more than 800 years of age. MoMA started 75 years ago as a museum in New York City. And yet, I think that the two have, at least in terms of their transformation in these last 2 decades, a great many similarities. Both have a very, very important relationship to the urban situation in which they're located. Obviously, the Louvre in the heart of Paris, and also a relationship to a continuous history, which is both part of the history of the institution, but also part of the history of the immediate urban surrounding area. In the case of the Louvre, obviously, the palace. In the case of MoMA, the institution itself. And finally, buildings and building projects, which when they were formulated for expansion, required that the architects and planners think about the relationship between a new intervention and an historical setting. Again, the historical settings are very, very different, but the continuity that needed to be found between the historical structure and the historical character of the existing buildings and what was being added to them was conceptually, I would argue, a very similar situation. So here the MoMA, for those of you who know it, this is 53rd Street. The original building is here from 1939 with additions in 1964 and then in 1984, and then here the new wing by Taniguchi and KPF architects that was opened in 2004. In the same way that the Louvre was constantly a construction site, and over a period of 800 years, there was never a moment of more than 40 or 50 years when there was not some new project. MoMA, although it's only 75 years old, has had a new construction project at least every 15 years since 1939, which is to say that MoMA has almost always been in the process of changing. And when this project, the most recent expansion, was started, the idea was to arrive at a state where the collection and all of the supporting facilities for the collection would, in some sense, be achieved, so that MoMA would have the sense that it arrived at a status quo. Since that intention was expressed 10 years ago, MoMA has since acquired more property further down on 53rd Street, and so it's just a matter of time now, probably about 15 years, until they start to think about expanding it again. MoMA, of course, occupying a very important situation in New York, and a very unusual situation for a museum in New York Those of you who know Manhattan know that museums are almost always on the major avenues, either on Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, or Madison. MoMA is one of the few museums which has a position in the center of a block, and so it does not have the same significance visually. And this was something that was very important in terms of thinking through the transformation. In terms of the priorities that were expressed for both the Louvre and for MoMA, obviously the key element was to create a new presentation of the collection. But beyond the issue or the concern for the collection, there were a set of programmatic interests and a set of programmatic responses that had very little to do with the traditional mission of the museum. MoMA, for example, decided that it would triple the size of the retail component, that it would build in the new building, that it would add 2 new theaters to the building, that it would have as many as 5 restaurants, and that above all, it would create an enormous amount of public open space, so that in a building which represents almost 40,000 square meters of new construction, the total amount of construction of gallery space was only 4,000 square meters. Now, MoMA had for many, many years suffered from not having sufficient restoration facilities, not having sufficient office space, not having sufficient support space for the collections, and all of this obviously was part of the intention in creating the expansion. But I think, and I would suggest to you that it's extremely significant that in a project of this size, and in a project which had a budget of 315 million American dollars in 1998, that only 1/10 of the total surface area was given to gallery space. Now, that 4,000 square meters still represented 50% more gallery space than MoMA had before. So it was very significant in terms of its impact on the collection, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment. But it represented, in terms of the total construction and in terms of the total conception, only one small part of the overall idea. Excuse me. And the same is true of the Louvre. The figures are much, much larger. The first portion of the Louvre, all of it underground, is called the Cour Napoleon and has, of course, the pyramid at its center. The second portion, which was executed almost at the same time, involved a new parking garage, a new restoration facility, new reserves for painting and sculpture, an entire area of orientation for groups in front of the Mur Charles V, one of the several pieces of archaeology that was on the site, and most controversially, also a major commercial gallery that connected from the Rue de Rivoli and the subway to the Arc de Carrousel and into the building itself. When you look at this plan, only those pieces which have color are open to the public, either color or the pale tan color here. So that everything that is shown in gray or in white here is either back of house, that is to say spaces that the public never sees, or spaces that do not directly have to do with the presentation of art. So once again, in almost 100,000 square meters of construction, the total construction of gallery space was less than 2,000 square meters. Once again, an enormous quantity, both in support, but also to create a great new public venue. And among those pieces that were given to the public was a major new theater for 450 seats, 3 levels of restaurants, a 2-level bookstore, and a series of other shops to sell items that were reproduced from the Louvre collection, and an entire area given over to education and orientation for groups. All of these things arguably very important to the mission of the Louvre as it was reconceived